Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the crowded streets, towering monuments, and hidden shadows of ancient Rome. Before you settle in for the night, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy these sleepy journeys through history. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us drift together into the difficult life of a man who owned nothing, not even himself. The year is AD 118. The Roman Empire stands near the height of its power. Its borders stretch across 3 continents. Its roads connect distant provinces. Its armies guard thousands of miles of frontier. Marble temples rise above busy forums. Merchants carry goods from Britain, Egypt, Syria, and Spain. To outsiders, Rome appears magnificent, unstoppable, eternal. Yet beneath this display of wealth and authority lives a population rarely celebrated by historians. Millions of slaves. Some work in mines, others labor on farms. Many serve wealthy households. Some educate children, others clean floors. Some spend their entire lives chained. Others enjoy unusual privileges, but all share one reality. They belong to someone else. Tonight's story follows one of them. Not a famous slave, not a rebel leader, not a gladiator, simply an ordinary man trying to survive inside a system designed to use him. His name is Lucius, though even that name is not truly his own. Like many slaves in Rome, the name was given after his capture. The original name bestowed by his family has long been forgotten by everyone except himself, and even he rarely speaks it aloud. He was born far from Rome, far from marble forums, far from senators and emperors. His earliest memories come from a small settlement near the Danube frontier, a place of forests, muddy paths, and cold winters. His people lived simple lives. They farmed, raised animals, fished rivers, repaired wooden homes after storms. The empire existed nearby, but not directly above them. Roman traders occasionally appeared. Soldiers occasionally marched past. Yet daily life remained largely unchanged, at least for a while. Everything altered during one summer raid. Lucius was 12 years old enough to help in fields, too young to understand how quickly a life could disappear. The attack came before sunrise. Dogs barked, voices shouted, smoke drifted through the darkness. His father rushed outside, carrying a spear. His mother pulled children toward safety. Confusion spread through every home. Nobody understood what was happening. Then armed men entered the village. Some were raiders from neighboring tribes. Others were mercenaries seeking profit. In the chaos, homes burned. People fled. Others fought. Many never returned. Lucius remembered running, branches striking his face, the sound of screaming somewhere behind him, his younger sister crying. Then rough hands seized his arm. After that, events blurred together. Days of walking, groups of captives, ropes around wrists, constant fear. Nobody explained where they were going. Nobody cared. Captives represented merchandise. Nothing more. Several weeks later, traders transported them south. The journey eventually brought them into Roman territory. There, buyers examined prisoners the same way farmers inspected livestock. Teeth, muscles, age, health, potential value. Lucius discovered an uncomfortable truth. Human beings could be sold, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. A person could become property. The realization frightened him more than the journey itself. At a market near Aquileia, buyers walked between rows of captives. Some children cried, others stared silently. Many adults looked exhausted beyond words. Prices varied according to skill, age, appearance, and physical condition. Strong laborers attracted attention. Healthy young women often sold quickly. Educated captives commanded higher sums. Older prisoners brought less. One merchant grabbed Lucius by the chin and turned his head toward a potential customer. The customer barely looked at his face. Instead, he examined shoulders and arms, evaluating future labor, calculating profit. Within minutes, a price was negotiated. Coins exchanged hands. Ownership changed. Lucius belonged to someone new. The buyer was not particularly wealthy, nor particularly poor. A Roman businessman named Quintus Varro. He owned a modest urban household and several workshops. To him, purchasing a young slave represented an investment, someone who could work for years, perhaps decades. The trip to Rome followed shortly afterward. For Lucius, the city seemed impossible. Buildings stretched higher than anything he had imagined. Crowds filled streets. Wagons rattled over stone roads. Vendors shouted. Animals pushed through traffic. The smell of smoke mixed with cooking food, sewage, sweat, and countless other scents. Everything felt enormous, overwhelming, relentless. Nothing resembled home. Upon arriving at Quintus's residence, Lucius entered a world governed by strict hierarchy. At the top stood Quintus himself, below him his wife, then freeborn children, then household managers. Only afterward came slaves. Even among slaves, status differed dramatically. Some served directly inside the house. Others worked in workshops. A few possessed specialized skills. Many performed difficult physical labor. Lucius began at the bottom. His first responsibilities were simple but exhausting. Carrying water, sweeping floors, cleaning courtyards, transporting supplies, running messages, fetching items forgotten by masters, completing tasks nobody else wanted. Work began before sunrise. It often ended long after darkness arrived. The household woke early. So did the slaves. Every day started with preparation. Fires required tending. Water needed carrying. Rooms demanded cleaning. Meals had to be organized. Before free members of the household opened their eyes, dozens of tasks were already underway. Mistakes invited punishment, not always severe punishment, but punishment nonetheless. A broken dish, a forgotten errand, a delayed response. Any could result in shouting, beatings, reduced food, or other penalties. The uncertainty proved almost as stressful as the labor itself. Some days passed quietly, others changed suddenly. Everything depended on moods, and moods could shift without warning. During his first months, Lucius learned Latin, not because anyone wished to educate him, because survival required understanding orders. At first, he recognized only a few words, then dozens, then hundreds. Gradually, conversations became comprehensible. This created new difficulties. Previously, he had not understood insults. Now he understood everyone. Yet language also opened opportunities. The household steward noticed his quick learning. Lucius could remember instructions, complete errands efficiently, adapt to changing demands. These qualities mattered. In Roman households, capable slaves sometimes advanced into more trusted positions. Not freedom, not equality, simply slightly better circumstances. Even small improvements felt valuable. The food illustrated this reality clearly. Household slaves generally ate enough to remain useful. Owners had practical reasons to keep workers alive and productive, but nobody confused necessity with generosity. Meals often consisted of bread, porridge, vegetables, olives, and occasional leftovers. Quality varied dramatically. Masters enjoyed the finest portions. Slaves received whatever remained. Hunger never entirely disappeared, especially for younger workers still growing. Lucius frequently found himself thinking about meals from childhood. Simple meals, yet somehow richer in memory than anything available now. The memories hurt, but he could not stop revisiting them. Faces appeared too. His mother, his father, his sister. Were they alive? Dead? Enslaved somewhere else? He had no way of knowing. Rome swallowed people. Millions arrived. Millions vanished into its machinery. Families disappeared every day. Records rarely cared. Years passed. Lucius grew taller, stronger, more experienced. The frightened village boy slowly transformed into a capable young servant. Yet one fact remained unchanged. Legally, he was property. He could not marry, could not own himself, could not choose where to live, could not leave. His future belonged to someone else. And as adulthood approached, he began realizing how completely that reality shaped every corner of life. Because soon he would discover that surviving Rome as a slave required far more than obedience. It required understanding the invisible rules that governed everyone around him, rules that could elevate a slave's position or destroy it overnight, and one ordinary morning, while delivering supplies to one of Quintus Varro's workshops, Lucius would witness something that permanently altered his understanding of what awaited him in the years ahead. Part 2. The workshop stood several streets away from Quintus Varro's residence, tucked between a baker's shop and a crowded apartment building, whose upper floors seemed to lean precariously over the narrow street below. Lucius had walked this route dozens of times. The journey itself rarely changed. Vendors arranged produce. Mule carts clogged intersections. Citizens argued over prices. Children darted between pedestrians. The city never truly rested. Even at dawn, movement seemed constant. On that particular morning, Lucius carried a bundle of wax tablets and account records requested by the workshop manager. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. Yet as he approached the entrance, he noticed a crowd gathered nearby. Workers had stopped. Passers-by lingered. Conversations carried a strange tone. Curiosity, concern, amusement, several emotions mixed together. Lucius edged closer. Inside the crowd stood a slave, or rather, a slave who had recently been punished. The man knelt beside a wooden post. His tunic hung in tatters. Fresh bruises covered his shoulders. A sign had been hung around his neck. Even from a distance, Lucius could read the words. The man had attempted theft. The punishment was meant to be public. Everyone passing through the neighborhood could see the consequences. Nobody hid such displays. Rome often preferred visible reminders. The message extended beyond the offender. Every slave in sight understood the warning. Do not steal. Do not deceive. Do not forget your place. Lucius watched silently. The punished man stared at the ground. No tears. No pleas. Only exhaustion. A strange feeling settled inside Lucius. Not because punishment itself surprised him. He had already seen beatings, seen scars, seen slaves disciplined for mistakes. What unsettled him was the crowd's reaction. Most people barely cared. A quick glance, a shrug, then they continued their day. To many Romans, punishment of slaves seemed as ordinary as repairing a roof or buying bread. The suffering of another person had become routine, expected, unremarkable. That realization stayed with him long after he completed his delivery. Back at the household, daily duties resumed. Water jars needed filling. Floors required sweeping. Supplies had to be organized. Life continued, yet the image remained fixed in his thoughts. Over the following years, Lucius learned that Rome contained many different forms of slavery. Some were harsh beyond imagination. Others appeared almost comfortable from the outside. The differences could be enormous. A slave working in silver mines might survive only a few years. A household secretary could spend his days reading and writing. One man might sleep in chains. Another might manage financial records thousands of denarii. Yet beneath these differences existed a shared reality. Neither man controlled his own fate. Everything depended upon ownership. Everything. One evening, while serving wine during a dinner gathering, Lucius overheard several guests discussing an estate in Sicily. The conversation drifted toward agricultural production, wheat yields, olive harvests, labor costs. The language sounded remarkably familiar to modern business discussions, except for one detail. The labor force being discussed consisted almost entirely of slaves, hundreds of them. One guest complained that replacing workers after disease outbreaks had become expensive. Another described purchasing new laborers from traders. They spoke calmly, rationally, not cruelly, not angrily, simply as businessmen discussing resources. Lucius lowered his eyes and continued serving. No one at the table noticed his discomfort, or perhaps they did not care. To them, slavery represented a normal part of society. Questioning it would have seemed as strange as questioning the existence of roads. The institution surrounded them from birth. Most never imagined an alternative. As Lucius entered his 20th year, his responsibilities expanded. The household steward increasingly trusted him with errands involving money. Small sums at first, then larger amounts. Accuracy mattered. Honesty mattered. A capable slave could become valuable. A valuable slave often received better treatment, not from kindness, from practicality. Owners protected useful investments. This created a complicated relationship between master and slave. Some owners rewarded loyalty. Others remained harsh regardless of service. Many existed somewhere in between. Quintus Varro belonged to that middle category. He was neither unusually cruel nor unusually generous. He expected obedience, expected competence, expected profit. When those expectations were met, life remained relatively stable. When they were not, consequences followed. One afternoon, Lucius accompanied the steward to collect payments from several merchants. The task took them through districts he rarely visited. There he encountered another side of Rome, luxury beyond imagination, massive villas, private gardens, imported marble, fountains decorated with statues, rooms larger than entire village homes. The wealth astonished him, especially because he knew what existed only a few streets away. Crowded apartment blocks, poor laborers, families squeezed into tiny rooms, workers struggling to afford food. Rome contained immense riches and immense hardship, often side by side. The contrast seemed impossible, yet nobody appeared surprised. Such inequalities had become ordinary. That evening, after returning home, Lucius sat among other slaves during their brief period of rest. Conversations drifted through the group. Some discussed work, Others shared rumors. A few spoke about freedom. Freedom, the word always attracted attention, not because it was common, because it was rare. In Rome, some slaves eventually gained manumission, legal freedom granted by an owner. Sometimes it rewarded years of faithful service. Sometimes it formed part of a will. Occasionally, slaves purchased freedom, using savings accumulated over many years. The possibility existed, but possibility and probability were different matters. Many slaves never achieved it. Others spent decades hopping. Still, hope persisted. Humans cling to hope, even when evidence suggests otherwise. One older slave named Felix often spoke about freedom. He had served the same family for nearly 30 years. According to household rumor, his owner intended to free him eventually. Nobody knew whether the story was true. Perhaps Felix himself did not know, yet he repeated the belief frequently, not boastfully, almost prayerfully, as though saying it aloud helped preserve the dream. Lucius listened more than he spoke. He found himself wondering what freedom would actually mean. Could he return home? Probably not. The village might no longer exist. Even if it survived, decades had passed. Faces would have changed. Children had become adults. Adults had become elderly. Some had died. The life he remembered belonged to another world. Perhaps freedom would not mean returning. Perhaps it would mean beginning again. The uncertainty troubled him, yet he could not stop imagining possibilities. Months later, an event occurred that deeply affected the household. One of the younger kitchen slaves fell ill. At first, nobody worried. Illness was common. Most recovered. This time proved different. The fever worsened. Days passed. The young slave became weaker. Eventually, he could no longer stand. Roman medicine possessed limitations. Some treatments helped. Many did not. Doctors existed, but outcomes remained uncertain. The household continued functioning, while the sick boy lay nearby. Work never stopped. Tasks still needed completion. Meals still required preparation. Life moved forward. Then one morning, the boy failed to wake. He had been perhaps 16 years old, maybe 17. No one knew precisely. Records for slaves often lacked detail. The death produced sadness among fellow servants. Yet outside their circle, little attention followed. A replacement would eventually be purchased. Operations would continue. The machine kept moving. Lucius attended the simple burial arranged for household slaves. Nothing elaborate, nothing grand. As he stood there, watching workers lower the body into the earth, a sobering realization emerged. For all Rome's power, many people vanished without leaving meaningful traces behind. No monuments, no biographies, no grand memorials. Entire lives disappeared almost silently. Farm laborers, dock workers, household servants, millions of ordinary individuals whose names history barely recorded. The thought lingered because Lucius understood he belonged to that category. If he died tomorrow, few beyond the household would notice. The empire would continue unchanged. Emperors would rule, armies would march, senators would debate, merchants would trade, the world would move on. Yet, despite such realities, people continued living, continued laughing, continued forming friendships, continued falling in love. Human beings persisted, even inside difficult circumstances. Over the next year, Lucius developed a friendship with another household slave named Diodorus. Unlike Lucius, Diodorus came from the eastern provinces. He possessed an education unusual among slaves. Before captivity, he had studied reading, mathematics, and literature. Those skills had increased his value. Eventually, he became involved in record keeping. The two men often spoke during evening hours. History, languages, memories, dreams, conversations offered a temporary escape from routine. Diodorus possessed a habit of asking uncomfortable questions. One night, he asked something Lucius never forgot. If freedom arrived tomorrow, he said quietly, what would you do first? Lucius considered the question. 100 answers came to mind, then vanished. Finally, he shrugged. I don't know. Diodorus nodded. Neither do I. The answer surprised them both. For years, they had dreamed about freedom, yet neither truly understood life beyond slavery anymore. The institution had shaped their identities, their routines, their expectations, their understanding of the world. Freedom remained desirable, yet it also felt strangely unfamiliar. That realization carried a certain sadness, because it revealed how deeply Rome could transform a person, not only through chains, through habit, through time, through adaptation. And while Lucius wrestled with those thoughts, events far beyond the household were beginning to shift. Changes in trade, changes in politics, changes in the fortunes of Quintus Varro himself. At first, the signs appeared insignificant. A delayed payment, a business setback, a failed investment, small problems, manageable problems. Yet over the coming months, those problems would grow, and Lucius would soon discover that when a Roman master encountered financial trouble, slaves often paid part of the price. Part 3. The first signs were easy to overlook. A delayed shipment, a merchant who failed to pay on time, a business agreement that produced less profit than expected. Such difficulties were common in Rome. Trade carried risks. Ships sank. Harvests failed. Markets shifted. Most household slaves paid little attention to these matters because they seemed distant from daily life. Yet Lucius gradually noticed changes. Small changes, subtle changes, the sort of details that become visible only when someone has spent years observing the same routines. Quintus Varro appeared increasingly distracted. He spent longer hours reviewing account records. Conversations with visiting merchants grew more tense. The steward spoke in quieter tones. Even the atmosphere during meals seemed different. Nothing dramatic, just a faint undercurrent of concern. At first, Lucius assumed the troubles would pass. Most difficulties eventually did, but weeks became months, and the situation failed to improve. One afternoon, while organizing storage supplies, Lucius overheard part of an argument between Quintus and a business associate. The discussion involved debts, several large debts. The associate insisted on repayment. Quintus argued for more time. Neither man sounded pleased. Neither appeared willing to compromise. The conversation ended abruptly. The visitor departed. Quintus remained standing in the courtyard long after the gates closed behind him. That evening, household rumors spread rapidly. Rumors always moved quickly among slaves. Information represented a form of survival. Knowing what happened around you could mean the difference between preparation and disaster. According to whispers, one of Quintus's investments had collapsed. A shipping venture. Several vessels lost during storms. Cargo gone. Money gone. Profit transformed into loss. No one knew every detail, but everyone understood one thing. Financial problems rarely remained confined to accounting records. Eventually, they affected real people. The effects began slowly. Household expenses tightened. Food portions became slightly smaller. Repairs were postponed. New purchases disappeared. Then came something more troubling. 2 workshop slaves were sold. The announcement arrived without warning. One morning, they were present. By evening, they were gone, transferred to a new owner. A different life, a different future. No discussion, no farewell celebration. Simply a transaction. Lucius watched the departures with a heavy feeling in his chest. He had known both men for years. Not closely, but well enough. Shared meals, shared work, shared conversations. Now they had vanished, perhaps forever. This served as a brutal reminder of an uncomfortable truth. Friendships among slaves always existed beneath a shadow. At any moment, someone could be sold, transferred, punished, separated. Relationships remained vulnerable because ownership remained absolute. Diodorus shared similar concerns. One evening, the two sat near a storage room after completing their duties. The city outside continued its endless noise. Wheels rattled, dogs barked, voices drifted through nearby streets. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Diodorus broke the silence. Do you ever think about how strange it is? Lucius glanced toward him. What? We spend years building lives, friendships, habits, memories. He paused. Yet someone else can erase all of it with a single decision. Lucius understood immediately. No further explanation was necessary. That was one of slavery's cruelest features. The uncertainty, not knowing whether tomorrow would resemble today, not knowing whether familiar faces would remain, not knowing whether everything might suddenly change. As autumn approached, further sales followed. A cook, 2 laborers, an elderly servant who had worked in the household longer than anyone could remember. The departures unsettled everyone, especially because nobody knew who might be next. Lucius tried to focus on work. There was little else he could do. Each day began before dawn. Each day ended after sunset. Tasks continued regardless of personal worries. Water still needed carrying. Records still needed organizing. Supplies still required transport. Life rarely paused for anxiety, yet anxiety persisted. During this period, Lucius became increasingly valuable to the household. His literacy had improved considerably. His reliability remained strong. The steward frequently assigned him responsibilities involving inventories and accounts. Such duties carried advantages. Physical labor decreased slightly. Trust increased, but increased value brought its own concerns. Valuable slaves could be retained. They could also be sold for higher prices. Both possibilities remained equally real. One rainy afternoon, Quintus summoned several household servants, Lucius among them. The gathering occurred in a small reception room. Nothing about the setting felt unusual, yet tension filled the air. Quintus looked tired, older somehow. The confident businessman Lucius had known for years seemed diminished, not defeated, but burdened. He informed them that adjustments would be necessary. The household faced challenges. Expenses needed reduction. Everyone would be expected to work harder. Efficiency mattered. Waste would not be tolerated. The speech itself remained calm, measured, practical, but its meaning was obvious. Difficult times had arrived. Afterward, conversations among slaves intensified. Speculation flourished. Would more people be sold? Would wages for hired workers disappear? Would punishments become harsher? Nobody knew, and uncertainty often proved worse than bad news. Weeks passed. Winter arrived. Cold winds swept through the city. Rain turned streets muddy. Travel became unpleasant. Business activity slowed. Inside the household, routines adapted to seasonal conditions. Fires required constant attention. Storage supplies needed monitoring. Everyone sought warmth where possible. During one particularly cold evening, Lucius found himself assigned to assist an elderly slave named Marcus, not the soldier of famous stories, just an aging servant nearing the end of his working life. Marcus had spent more than 40 years in slavery, longer than Lucius had been alive. His hair had turned gray. His back had begun to bend. His movements slowed each year. Together, They organized storage records by lamplight. The task itself was mundane. Hours of counting and recording. Eventually, conversation emerged. It often did during repetitive work. Marcus asked about Lucius's childhood, a rare question. Most people never inquired. Lucius described fragments. The village, the river, the forests, memories blurred by time. Marcus listened quietly. Then he nodded. I barely remember mine. The admission surprised Lucius. How long were you enslaved? Since I was younger than you were. Lucius stared at the records, trying to imagine such a thing. 4 decades, most of an entire lifetime. Marcus smiled faintly. Not a happy smile, a reflective one. Memory changes, he said. At first, you remember everything. He arranged another tablet. Then details begin disappearing. Another pause. Faces become harder to picture. Lucius felt unexpectedly uncomfortable because he recognized the process. Already, some childhood memories had faded. Certain voices, certain expressions, entire days, once vivid now, existed only as fragments. Time eroded everything, even grief, especially grief. That realization frightened him more than he cared to admit. As winter deepened, illness spread through parts of the city. Such outbreaks were common. Rome's enormous population created ideal conditions for disease. Crowded housing, poor sanitation, constant movement of people. When sickness arrived, it traveled easily. The household remained fortunate. Several servants became ill. Most recovered. Others elsewhere did not. Funeral processions appeared more frequently in the streets. Business suffered further. Customers vanished. Trade slowed. Economic pressure increased. Then came the moment everyone had feared. One morning, the steward posted a list. Several names appeared. Those individuals would be sold. Lucius approached cautiously, heart pounding. Every slave in the household seemed drawn toward the announcement. Eyes scanned the names, searching, praying, fearing. Relief arrived first. His name was absent. Then guilt followed, because others were not so fortunate. Among those listed stood Diodorus. For several seconds, Lucius simply stared, certain he had misread it. But the name remained, unchanged, permanent. Diodorus himself arrived moments later. He examined the list, read it once, then again. His expression remained strangely calm. Perhaps shock, perhaps acceptance, perhaps both. The sale occurred 3 days later. 3 days. That was all. Years of friendship reduced to 72 hours. The two men spent as much time together as circumstances allowed, talking, remembering, speculating about the future. Neither wished to discuss the obvious reality. They might never meet again. On the final evening, they sat near the courtyard after completing their work. The winter air felt sharp. cold enough to sting exposed skin. For a long time, neither spoke. Eventually, Diodorus laughed softly, a strange sound under the circumstances. "What is it?" Lucius asked. Diodorus shook his head. "I was thinking about that question." "What question?" "The one about freedom." Lucius remembered. Years earlier, a conversation after work. A simple question. What would you do if freedom arrived tomorrow? Diodorus looked toward the darkening sky. "Funny thing," he said. "I still don't know the answer." Lucius managed a faint smile. Neither did he. The next morning buyers arrived. Transactions occurred. Money changed hands. Ownership changed hands. By afternoon, Diodorus was gone. Just like that. No ceremony. No recognition. No guarantee of future contact. The emptiness left behind surprised Lucius. The household continued functioning. Work continued. Life continued. Yet something felt missing. A voice, a friend, a familiar presence. For several weeks afterward, Lucius caught himself expecting Diodorus to appear around corners or join conversations. Then reality returned. The absence remained, and with Diodorus gone, Lucius began understanding something deeply unsettling. Survival in Rome required more than endurance, more than obedience, more than hard work. Sometimes survival depended entirely upon circumstances beyond your control. A storm at sea, a failed investment, a debt, a decision made by strangers. Any of these could reshape a life overnight. And before long, another unexpected decision would reshape Lucius's future as well, because a visitor was about to arrive at Quintus Varro's household, a visitor carrying news that would offer Lucius something he had not experienced in many years. Not freedom, not yet, but something almost as dangerous. Hope. Part 4. Winter loosened its grip gradually. The cold rains became less frequent. The days lengthened. Markets grew busier. Street vendors remained outside later into the evening. Rome seemed to awaken once more. For most people, the change of season brought a sense of renewal. For Lucius, however, the passing months felt unusually empty. Diodorus had been gone for nearly half a year. No message had arrived. No news. No rumors. Nothing. The silence itself became its own answer. Rome was vast. People disappeared into it every day. The odds of former friends crossing paths again were slim. Lucius understood this, yet understanding did not make acceptance easier. Life continued much as before. Work filled each day. The household remained under financial pressure. Though conditions had stabilized somewhat, the worst fears of total collapse had not materialized. Quintus Varro's businesses survived. Damaged, certainly, but not destroyed. That meant fewer sales, fewer sudden changes, at least for the moment. One bright morning in early spring, a visitor arrived at the household. At first, nothing about the man seemed unusual. Visitors came regularly. Merchants, lawyers, business partners, suppliers, tax collectors. Rome produced an endless stream of people, conducting endless streams of business. This visitor, however, remained longer than most. Hours passed. Conversations continued behind closed doors. Documents appeared. Additional records were requested. The steward moved through the house, repeatedly carrying tablets and account scrolls. Something important was happening. By evening, rumors had already begun spreading. Nobody knew the full story, but fragments emerged. The visitor represented a wealthy senator, a very wealthy senator, one with substantial estates outside the city. Apparently, some sort of partnership was under discussion. Perhaps an investment, perhaps a purchase, perhaps something else entirely. For several days, uncertainty lingered. Then answers arrived. Not all at once. Piece by piece, the senator, named Gaius Cassianus, had acquired partial ownership in several of Quintus Varro's struggling enterprises. The arrangement would provide desperately needed capital. In return, Cassianus gained influence and profit rights. To the businessmen involved, the agreement probably seemed straightforward. To the slaves, however, it carried unknown consequences. New owners often brought new priorities. New priorities often meant change, and change rarely asked permission. A week later, Lucius learned precisely how much change was coming. The steward summoned him. That alone was not unusual, but the location felt different. A private office, records spread across a large table, several documents already prepared. The steward motioned for Lucius to enter, then closed the door. Lucius immediately felt uneasy. Important conversations behind closed doors rarely involved pleasant surprises. The steward studied him for a moment, almost thoughtfully. Then he spoke. "Your name has been requested." Lucius frowned slightly. Requested? By whom? For what purpose? The household of Senator Cassianus. The answer only deepened his confusion. The steward continued. The senator reviewed several personnel records connected to the business arrangement. Personnel records, an oddly formal phrase for slaves, yet technically accurate. To wealthy Romans, slaves often appeared within inventories and records, alongside other assets. The steward tapped one of the tablets. Your literacy, your accounting experience, your reliability. He paused. The senator wishes to acquire your service. Acquire, such a simple word, yet it carried enormous weight. Lucius understood immediately. He was being transferred. Sold. Again. Not because of misconduct. Not because of punishment. Because someone had decided he might prove useful elsewhere. A strange mixture of emotions surged through him. Fear, confusion, uncertainty, and beneath them all curiosity. The steward must have noticed. "Do not look so alarmed." Lucius remained silent. The steward folded his hands. Cassianus maintains one of the most respected households in Rome. Another pause. Many would consider this fortunate. Perhaps, or perhaps not. Fortune often depended upon perspective. 3 weeks later, the transfer became official. Lucius packed the few possessions he owned. The collection was surprisingly small. A spare tunic, a wooden comb, several personal items accumulated over years. Nothing of great value. Everything he could call his own fit inside a single bundle. That reality struck him unexpectedly. 2 decades of slavery, years of labor, years of life, reduced to a package small enough to carry under one arm. On the morning of departure, he stood in the courtyard where he had spent much of his adult life. The surroundings felt familiar, almost comforting. For all its hardships, the household had become home in a strange way. Not home as he once understood the word, but home nonetheless. People adapt. Humans become accustomed even to circumstances they never would have chosen. The gates opened. A servant from Cassianus's household waited outside. The time had come. Lucius took one final look around, then followed. The journey across Rome lasted nearly an hour. As they traveled, the city revealed its endless variety. Bustling marketplaces, religious shrines, public baths, crowded tenement buildings, elegant villas. The contrasts remained astonishing. Luxury and poverty existed side by side, often separated by only a few streets. Eventually, they reached their destination, the residence of Gaius Cassianus. Lucius had seen wealthy homes before. Nothing prepared him for this. The property occupied an enormous area. Marble columns framed the entrance. Gardens stretched beyond visible sight. Decorative fountains sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Statues lined pathways. Servants moved efficiently through carefully maintained grounds. The scale alone seemed overwhelming. This was not merely a wealthy household. It was an institution, a small world unto itself. Upon entering, Lucius immediately noticed another difference: the number of slaves. Everywhere he looked, servants worked. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. Gardeners, secretaries, teachers, cooks, messengers, porters, house attendants, specialists performing tasks he could barely identify. The operation resembled a miniature city, complex, structured, organized. For the first few days, Lucius simply observed, learning names, learning procedures, learning expectations. The hierarchy proved intricate, far more complicated than anything he had previously experienced. Certain slaves possessed significant authority over others. Some managed finances. Others supervised entire departments. Status among slaves varied enormously. One man might scrub floors, another might oversee valuable estates. Legally, both remained slaves. Practically, their daily lives differed dramatically. Lucius received assignment within the household's administrative section. His duties centered around records, inventories, and correspondence. The work demanded concentration rather than physical strength. For the first time in years, his hands spent more time holding writing tools than carrying heavy loads. The change felt almost unreal, yet it also carried pressure. Mistakes involving records could affect enormous sums of money. Accuracy mattered. Every detail mattered. Several weeks passed. Gradually, Lucius adapted. The household functioned with remarkable efficiency. Everything seemed planned, organized, calculated. Senator Cassianus himself appeared rarely, yet his influence touched every aspect of operations. The man possessed wealth beyond anything Lucius had previously encountered. Estates throughout Italy, properties in multiple provinces, investments across the empire. His affairs generated mountains of records. Mountains of records required people to manage them. One evening, while organizing account tablets, Lucius met an older administrative slave named Titus. Titus had served Cassianus for nearly 25 years. He understood the household better than almost anyone. Over time, the two began talking regularly. Titus possessed a calm demeanor, thoughtful, observant, the sort of man who listened carefully before speaking. During one conversation, he asked about Lucius's previous household. Lucius described Quintus Varro, the business troubles, the transfers, the uncertainty. Titus nodded knowingly. Many arrive here the same way. Sold, transferred, purchased, inherited. He smiled faintly. Rome has many roads. The remark sounded simple, yet something about it lingered. Perhaps because it felt true. Countless lives moved through invisible pathways shaped by ownership. Different households, different masters, different circumstances, yet always the same underlying reality. A few days later, Titus shared information that immediately captured Lucius's attention. Information he had not expected. Information dangerous enough to inspire hope. The household, Titus explained, possessed a history of manumission. Freedom, not for everyone, not frequently, but often enough to become noticeable. Several former slaves now worked as freedmen, associated with Cassianus's affairs. Trusted administrators, business agents, clerks, men who had once been property, men who now possessed legal freedom. Lucius listened carefully, trying not to appear too interested. Yet his pulse quickened. Titus seemed amused. "You are wondering whether it could happen to you." Lucius hesitated, then nodded. Titus leaned back. Perhaps a single word, yet it carried enormous weight. Perhaps, not yes, not no, possibility, the most dangerous gift Rome could offer a slave, because hope could sustain a person. Hope could also break one, and over the coming years, Lucius would discover just how powerful and painful that hope could become. Part 5. The rumor spread through the administrative offices with the quiet speed of something people wanted to believe. Cassianus sometimes freed slaves, not often, not predictably, but often enough that examples existed. Lucius heard the names repeatedly. A former steward who now handled estate contracts as a freedman, an accountant who had been manumitted after decades of service, a secretary whose freedom formed part of his master's will. Each story ended the same way. Property became person, legally at least, for slaves who spent their lives navigating commands, punishments, and transfers. Such stories carried immense emotional force. They proved that the wall separating slavery from freedom was not completely solid. A gate existed somewhere. Whether one ever reached it was another matter. Lucius tried to keep his expectations under control. Experience had taught him caution. Too many things in Rome could change without warning. Still, the possibility settled into his thoughts. He found himself imagining futures he had long stopped imagining. Not dramatic fantasies, simple things, choosing where to sleep, keeping his earnings, walking through the city without belonging to anyone. The simplicity of those dreams made them feel more real. Work left little time for daydreaming. The administrative section operated from dawn until well after sunset. Records arrived constantly. Estate reports from the countryside, tax summaries, grain inventories, purchase contracts, shipping accounts, correspondence from agents across the empire. The volume astonished him. Cassianus's wealth depended upon information as much as land. Someone had to track everything. Lucius spent hours copying figures, checking totals, and organizing tablets into coherent records. Accuracy became a form of survival. A mistake could cost money. Money attracted attention. Attention was dangerous. Fortunately, he possessed a talent for careful work. Weeks became months. The senior administrators noticed. Assignments grew more complex. At first, he merely copied records. Then he began comparing reports from different estates. Eventually, he helped identify discrepancies in accounts. Small discrepancies, missing grain deliveries, incorrect totals, clerical errors. Nothing dramatic, yet useful. Useful people tended to receive better treatment, not because Rome valued justice, because Rome valued utility. One afternoon, Titus handed him a bundle of tablets and asked him to review them before evening. The records came from an estate in Campania. Olive production numbers, storage inventories, transport expenses. Lucius worked through them methodically. Near sunset, he noticed something odd. The transport costs exceeded the recorded shipments by a margin too large to explain easily. He checked again, then again. Same result. When he reported the discrepancy, Titus examined the tablets carefully. A faint smile appeared. Well spotted. The matter eventually reached higher administrators. An investigation followed. Nothing spectacular emerged, likely careless bookkeeping, rather than major fraud. But the correction saved a significant amount of money. Afterward, Titus treated Lucius with new respect. More importantly, others noticed as well. Reputation mattered, even among slaves, especially among slaves. In a large household, thousands of small judgments shaped a person's standing. Reliable, careless, honest, lazy, intelligent, troublesome. Such labels traveled quickly. Once attached, they could become difficult to change. As Lucius's responsibilities increased, his daily life improved in practical ways. His quarters remained modest, but cleaner than before. Meals became somewhat better. He spent less time performing heavy labor. The changes were real, yet they also created a strange emotional tension. His circumstances improved, while his legal status remained unchanged. He was still property, still transferable, still vulnerable to decisions made above him. Comfort did not erase dependence. The contradiction became especially clear during a festival in the city. Rome celebrated constantly. Religious festivals, civic celebrations, military triumphs, games, and public spectacles filled the calendar. During this particular festival, portions of the household staff received permission to attend public events in shifts. Lucius accompanied a group to the Circus Maximus. The scale overwhelmed him. The enormous stadium stretched farther than he could easily comprehend. Crowds poured through entrances by the tens of thousands. Vendors shouted. Musicians played. Bettors argued. The noise became almost physical. Chariot racing held a special power over Romans. Fans supported teams with near religious devotion. Blues, greens, reds, whites. Colors became identities. The crowd surged emotionally with every lap. Cheers thundered through the structure. Insults flew between rival supporters. Dust rose from the track. Horses strained. Drivers leaned dangerously around tight turns. Lucius watched the spectacle with genuine fascination. Yet another thought kept intruding. Thousands upon thousands of people surrounded him. Free citizens, foreign visitors, freedmen, soldiers, merchants, slaves, everyone packed together in the same enormous space. For a few hours, social distinctions blurred visually, but only visually. A citizen could leave and go wherever he wished. Lucius would return when ordered. The difference mattered more than the spectacle itself. Later that evening, as the group walked back toward the household, One younger slave named Felix spoke excitedly about the races. He had won a small wager through a friend. His energy was contagious. For a moment, everyone seemed lighter. Then another slave quietly remarked, "Enjoy the victory while you can." The comment sounded sharper than intended. An uncomfortable silence followed. Everyone understood the meaning. A slave's fortunes could change abruptly. Today's celebration offered no guarantee about tomorrow. The mood gradually recovered, but the reminder lingered. Months later, Lucius received an assignment that carried unusual significance. He was ordered to assist during preparations for a major dinner hosted by Cassianus. Important guests would attend: senators, magistrates, wealthy businessmen. The administrative staff needed additional support managing records, seating arrangements, deliveries, and expenses. The household transformed into controlled chaos. Extra food arrived. Musicians rehearsed. Servants polished silver and marble surfaces. Gardeners worked from dawn until dusk. Cooks barely slept. Lucius moved continuously between offices, storerooms, and reception areas. Late on the afternoon of the event, Titus pulled him aside. "The senator noticed your work on the Campanian accounts." Lucius stopped. "He noticed?" "Yes." Titus studied him briefly. "That is usually good news." Usually. The qualifier mattered. Still, the information sent a jolt through him. For years, he had existed beneath notice. One competent slave among many. The idea that Cassianus himself knew his name felt unreal. The dinner proceeded with impressive precision. Guests reclined in richly decorated rooms, while servants moved through carefully choreographed routines. Lucius remained mostly behind the scenes, handling documents and messages. Near midnight, however, he was summoned unexpectedly. A steward led him to a smaller reception room adjacent to the main banquet hall. Cassianus stood there with two other men reviewing account tablets. The senator looked older than Lucius had expected. Not weak, simply weathered by years of politics, business, and responsibility. Sharp eyes, controlled voice. He asked several questions about the Campanian discrepancy. Lucius answered carefully, concisely, factually. Cassianus listened without interruption. Then he nodded once. "Good work." 2 words. Nothing more. Yet Lucius felt oddly shaken afterward. Praise from a powerful man carried weight. Dangerous weight. Because praise could encourage ambition. Ambition could encourage hope. And hope in a slave was never entirely safe. Over the next year, Lucius continued advancing within the administrative section. Titus increasingly relied upon him. Other clerks sought his help with complicated inventories. His position became stable enough that newer slaves viewed him as experienced. The realization made him uneasy. He had become one of the established men. Years had passed almost without his noticing. Sometimes he caught sight of himself reflected in polished metal or still water, and saw an older face than he expected. The village boy had vanished long ago. One autumn evening, while reviewing estate correspondence, Titus spoke without looking up from his work. You know the question everyone is asking. Lucius pretended ignorance. Which question? Whether Cassianus intends to free you. The directness startled him. People are asking that. Titus gave a quiet snort. People always ask. He set down a tablet. You are educated, useful, trusted. The senator has noticed you personally. Those are the conditions under which such things sometimes happen. Sometimes, again that word, never certainty. Lucius felt his pulse quicken despite himself. Do you think it will happen? Titus considered the question for a long moment. Finally, he said, I think you should not build your life around expectations you do not control. Practical advice, sensible advice, probably correct, yet after years of slavery, even a small possibility could grow enormous inside the mind. And as Lucius returned to his quarters that night, he realized something had changed. Hope no longer felt abstract. It had become personal, which meant disappointment, if it came, would be personal too. Part 6. Hope proved difficult to manage once it settled into the mind. Lucius tried. He truly did. He followed Titus's advice as best he could. Focus on work. Focus on facts. Focus on what could actually be controlled. Yet every time he saw a freedman conducting business on behalf of Cassianus, the thought returned. Every time he heard another story of manumission, the thought returned. Every time someone casually mentioned freedom, the thought returned. What if? The question became impossible to silence. Years earlier, such thoughts had seemed distant, almost fictional. Now they felt close enough to touch, close enough to hurt. The months passed steadily. Cassianus's household continued operating with the same remarkable efficiency that had first impressed Lucius. Estates generated income. Merchants negotiated contracts. Administrators processed endless records. Hundreds of people performed thousands of tasks. The machine never stopped. Within that machine, Lucius occupied a respected position. Not powerful, not influential, but trusted. Trust carried value. One morning, Titus assigned him responsibility for reviewing reports from several rural properties. The task required comparing harvest estimates against actual deliveries. Tedious work, important work, exactly the sort of responsibility given only to reliable personnel. Lucius spent days examining records, numbers, inventories, transportation logs, payment receipts. The details blurred together, yet beneath the monotony lay something fascinating. These records revealed how enormous Roman wealth actually functioned. Great fortunes did not simply appear. They depended upon countless workers, farmers, laborers, craftsmen, sailors, accountants, messengers, thousands of people connected through systems of production and trade, and slaves existed throughout every layer. The empire rested heavily upon their labor. The realization never entirely left him. Rome celebrated emperors, generals, senators, yet beneath those famous names stood millions of ordinary people whose work made everything possible. Most would never appear in historical records. Their contributions vanished into the background, invisible but essential. One afternoon, Lucius accompanied a senior administrator on an inspection visit to a nearby estate owned by Cassianus. The property lay outside the city, not far, yet far enough to feel different. The air seemed cleaner, quieter. Open fields replaced crowded streets. For a man who had spent years surrounded by stone buildings and urban noise, the countryside awakened old memories, fragments of childhood, forests, rivers, open skis. The estate itself operated like a small community. Fields stretched across the landscape. Storage buildings stood near work areas. Laborers moved between tasks. Many were slaves. Others were hired workers. Everyone possessed responsibilities. Lucius spent much of the visit reviewing inventories and production reports. Yet during breaks, he observed the workers. Their lives differed from his own. Harder physically, simpler in some ways, more isolated in others. One older field slave caught his attention. The man worked steadily despite obvious age. Gray hair, weathered skin, stooped posture, years of labor visible in every movement. Later, Lucius asked about him. The answer surprised him. The man had spent nearly 50 years on the estate. 50 years, almost an entire lifetime. The number felt difficult to comprehend. That evening, while riding back toward Rome, Lucius found himself thinking about the old worker. 50 years, working the same land, serving the same household, watching decades pass, watching generations come and go. What thoughts filled a person after so much time? What memories remained? Did freedom still matter after 50 years? Or did survival become enough? The questions lingered. Several weeks later, unexpected news arrived. Titus was ill. At first, the illness seemed minor. Fatigue, fever, nothing unusual. Most people recovered from such ailments, but recovery never came. The fever worsened. Days stretched into weeks. Concern spread quietly through the administrative offices. Titus had become a central figure, experienced, knowledgeable, respected. Losing him would create difficulties for everyone. Lucius visited whenever possible. The older man appeared increasingly weak, yet his mind remained sharp. During one visit, Titus motioned for him to sit. "You remember our conversations about freedom?" Lucius nodded. Titus smiled faintly. "I spent 25 years expecting it." The statement carried no bitterness, only honesty. And eventually, I stopped expecting. He coughed, waited for the discomfort to pass. Life became easier after that. Lucius remained silent, unsure how to respond. Titus stared toward a nearby window. "Hope is useful." Another pause. "But it can also become a prison." The words settled heavily between them. A few days later, Titus died. The news spread quickly. Administrators, servants, freedmen, even some household managers appeared genuinely saddened. Titus had been part of the household for decades. His absence felt significant. Lucius attended the funeral, more substantial than the simple burials he had witnessed earlier in life. Still modest by Roman standards, yet respectful, standing among the mourners, he reflected on how strange life could be. Titus had spent decades serving one household, built relationships, earned trust, accumulated knowledge. Then suddenly, everything ended. A lifetime reduced to memory. The experience affected Lucius more deeply than he expected. Perhaps because Titus had become a mentor. Perhaps because the older man's warnings now felt more urgent. Perhaps because mortality seemed increasingly real. Lucius was no longer a young man. Years had accumulated quietly, one season after another, one responsibility after another. Time moved regardless of personal plans. After Titus's death, several administrative changes followed. Duties required redistribution. Positions required filling. The household could not pause indefinitely. Work continued. It always continued. To Lucius's surprise, many of Titus's former responsibilities gradually shifted toward him. Not all, but enough to notice. More records, more oversight, more trust. The increased workload proved challenging. Yet he managed. Months passed, then a year. Eventually, the transition became permanent. Lucius now occupied a position remarkably similar to the one Titus had once held. The realization felt strange, almost unsettling. He often caught himself repeating advice Titus had given years earlier, sometimes nearly word for word. Life possessed a curious habit of turning students into teachers. One evening, a younger slave named Publius approached him with a question. The young man worked in record management and clearly admired Lucius. "Can I ask something?" "Of course." Publius hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Do you think the senator might free me someday?" Lucius almost laughed at the familiarity of the question. Years earlier, he had asked essentially the same thing, the same uncertainty, the same hope. For a moment, Titus's face seemed almost present. Lucius finally answered. "Maybe." Publius looked encouraged. Lucius continued, "But don't let maybe become your entire life." The younger man frowned slightly, trying to understand. Lucius recognized the expression. He had worn it himself once. Some lessons required time. Advice alone could not provide them. As winter approached again, another unexpected development emerged. Cassianus's health had begun declining. Not dramatically, not immediately, but noticeably. The senator remained active, continued conducting business, continued managing affairs. Yet age was becoming impossible to ignore. Conversations about succession increased. Family members appeared more frequently. Lawyers visited often. Documents changed hands. Such matters interested most people only indirectly. Lucius, however, understood their significance. The future of an entire household could change when a wealthy master died. Ownership transferred. Policies changed. Promises vanished. Expectations disappeared. Everything depended upon decisions written into documents few slaves would ever see. And for the first time in many years, Lucius found himself facing a familiar uncertainty. Not because his position was weak, not because his work was unappreciated, but because powerful men eventually died. And when they did, countless lives could be reshaped overnight. Somewhere inside Cassianus's growing collection of legal papers lay decisions that might determine Lucius's future. Decisions already written. Decisions beyond his control. Decisions he would not discover until it was too late to change them. Part 7. The winter that followed felt unusually quiet, not because Rome itself had grown quieter. That was impossible. The city remained what it had always been. Merchants filled the markets. Builders repaired structures. Politicians argued. Priests conducted ceremonies. Crowds surged through streets from dawn until nightfall. Rome never truly slept. Yet within the household of Gaius Cassianus, a subtle change had settled over daily life. People watched, listened, waited. The senator's health remained uncertain. Some days he appeared strong, alert, engaged in business as usual. Other days he looked older than his years, tired, distracted, less interested in long meetings, less willing to entertain guests. Nobody spoke openly about mortality. Wealthy Romans rarely did. Yet everyone understood the reality. No man, regardless of status, escaped age forever. Lucius noticed the increase in visitors. Lawyers arrived frequently. Family members stayed longer. Administrators reviewed records with unusual care. Copies of documents multiplied. Property inventories were updated. The machinery of inheritance had begun moving. Slowly, quietly, methodically. To outsiders, these activities might seem boring, merely paperwork. Yet Lucius knew paperwork could change lives. A few lines written on wax tablets could determine who inherited estates, who controlled businesses, who received money, who received freedom, or who remained enslaved. That final possibility occupied his thoughts more than he wished to admit. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on responsibilities, yet uncertainty followed him everywhere. Several years earlier, he might have accepted whatever happened with resignation. Now things felt different. Hope had altered the equation. Once a person began imagining freedom, returning to complete indifference became difficult. One afternoon, while organizing correspondence, Lucius received instructions to deliver records directly to Cassianus's private study. Such assignments remained uncommon. Most communication passed through layers of managers and stewards. Direct contact with the senator occurred only when necessary. Lucius carried the tablets carefully. Upon entering, he found Cassianus seated near a window overlooking part of the garden. The senator looked thinner than before, older, yet his eyes remained sharp. The room contained shelves filled with documents, contracts, reports, letters, decades of accumulated business, the physical weight of a lifetime's work. Cassianus accepted the records, began reviewing them immediately. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. "How long have you served in this household?" The question caught Lucius off guard. "Nearly 12 years, master." Cassianus nodded. "And before that?" Lucius hesitated briefly. "The household of Quintus Varro." Another nod. The senator studied one of the tablets. "Titus spoke highly of you." The mention of Titus produced a surprising emotion, a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "He taught me much." Cassianus looked up. "He taught many people much." Silence followed. Then the senator returned his attention to the records. The conversation ended, yet the exchange lingered in Lucius's thoughts long afterward, not because anything extraordinary had been said, because it confirmed something important. Cassianus knew who he was, knew his history, knew his work. Whether that knowledge would matter remained uncertain, but it existed, and in a world where countless slaves passed unnoticed through life, being noticed carried significance. Spring arrived, then summer. The senator's health fluctuated. Some weeks appeared promising, others did not. Meanwhile, the household continued functioning. Estates generated revenue. Harvests required management. Contracts demanded attention. Life moved forward. Lucius increasingly found himself supervising younger administrators, a role he had never expected to occupy. One of them, Publius, had matured considerably. The eager young slave, who once asked endless questions, now handled responsibilities confidently. Watching the transformation felt strange. Time seemed to accelerate with age. Years passed more quickly than they once had. At least that was how it felt. One evening, after completing inventories, Publius remained behind. Clearly, something occupied his thoughts. Eventually, he spoke. "Do you ever wonder what happened to your family?" The question arrived unexpectedly. Lucius stared at the records before him. For a moment, he considered giving a simple answer. Instead, he told the truth. Every day. Publius looked surprised. After all these years, Lucius nodded. Especially after all these years, because the passage of time had not erased the question. It had only made answers less likely. His parents would be elderly, if alive. His sister might have children of her own. Entire generations could have passed. Yet somewhere inside him remained the 12-year-old boy who had lost everything in a single morning. Some wounds healed. Others simply became part of a person. Summer turned toward autumn. Then came the event everyone had quietly anticipated. Cassianus suffered a serious illness. The details remained private. Household rumors filled the gaps. Some claimed fever. Others suggested breathing difficulties. Still others blamed age itself. Whatever the cause, the outcome became increasingly clear. The senator was dying. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. The atmosphere throughout the household changed almost overnight. Conversations became quieter, more careful. Family members arrived from distant properties. Lawyers appeared daily. Administrators worked late into the night. Every major household in Rome eventually confronted this moment. The transfer of power, the transfer of property, the transfer of responsibility. Yet for slaves, another question existed beneath all the others. What happens to us? Ownership could pass to heirs. Households could be divided. Slaves could be inherited, sold, gifted, or freed. The possibilities varied enormously. The uncertainty affected everyone. Gardeners, cooks, secretaries, laborers. Nobody knew what the future held. Weeks later, Cassianus summoned several senior members of the household, Lucius among them. The gathering occurred in a private chamber, smaller than the grand reception halls. More personal, the senator appeared frail, frailer than Lucius had ever seen him. Yet his voice remained steady. One by one, he addressed matters requiring attention: estate management, financial oversight, household operations, specific instructions, specific expectations. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Near the end, Cassianus looked toward Lucius. "You served well." The words seemed simple, yet they carried weight. The senator rarely offered praise casually. Lucius bowed his head. "Thank you, master." Cassianus nodded slightly, then moved to the next topic. The meeting concluded shortly afterward. Nobody mentioned what everyone understood. It was likely a farewell. 3 months later, Gaius Cassianus died. The news spread through Rome rapidly. Wealthy senators attracted attention. Business associates arrived. Political allies arrived. Relatives arrived. The household entered a period of intense activity, funeral preparations, legal proceedings, administrative transitions. Everything happened simultaneously. For the slaves, however, one concern overshadowed all others. The will, somewhere within the senator's final instructions, lay answers. Answers that would shape countless futures. Yet reading and verifying such documents required time. Days passed, then weeks. Rumors multiplied, some optimistic, some alarming. Nobody knew which to believe. Lucius continued working, continued waiting, continued wondering. The uncertainty felt almost unbearable. He found himself sleeping poorly, thinking constantly, imagining possibilities, dismissing them, then imagining new ones. Finally, the day arrived. Senior household personnel gathered in a large chamber. Lawyers, family representatives, administrators, key servants. The atmosphere felt tense. Everyone understood the importance of what was about to occur. Documents were presented. Witnesses confirmed details. Instructions began to be read. Property distributions, financial arrangements, estate assignments. The process continued for hours. Lucius listened carefully, yet his own future remained unclear. Then, at last, a particular section appeared, a section concerning household servants. Names were read. Some received transfers to heirs. Others remained attached to specific estates. A handful were granted freedom. Each announcement sent ripples through the room. Hearts rose, hearts fell, lives changed. Then Lucius heard his own name. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The room vanished. The voices vanished. Only the sound of his name remained. He strained to hear the next words, and what followed would alter the course of his life more completely than anything since the day he had been captured as a child. Part 8. For a moment, Lucius wondered if he had misheard. The lawyer continued reading. The words sounded clear, yet his mind struggled to process them. Years of habit resisted the meaning. Years of slavery resisted the possibility. Around him, the chamber remained silent. People listened carefully, some with curiosity, some with indifference, some with personal concern about their own futures. But for Lucius, the world had narrowed to a single sentence. According to the final wishes of Gaius Cassianus, Lucius was to be granted manumission. Freedom, not immediately. Certain administrative procedures remained. Legal formalities remained. Documentation remained. Yet the decision itself was unmistakable. Freedom, the word echoed through his thoughts. He had imagined this moment many times, too many times, during sleepless nights, during long hours of work, during endless seasons of uncertainty. Yet reality felt strangely different from imagination. He expected joy. Instead, he felt shock, almost disbelief. The lawyer continued reading additional instructions, other names, other decisions, other futures. Lucius heard none of it. His thoughts drifted elsewhere, to forests near the Danube, to a village long vanished from his life, to Titus, to Diodorus, to people who never lived long enough to experience this moment. The reading eventually concluded. Conversations resumed. People began discussing practical matters. Administrators exchanged information. Lawyers organized documents. The machinery of inheritance moved forward. Lucius remained standing quietly, trying to understand what had just happened. A hand touched his shoulder. Publius, the younger slave, looked almost more excited than Lucius himself. "You heard?" Lucius nodded. "I heard." Publius smiled broadly. "You're free." The statement sounded simple, yet hearing it spoken aloud made something feel real for the first time. Free, not a possibility, not a dream, not a rumor, a fact, or nearly a fact. The final paperwork required several weeks. Roman bureaucracy moved carefully when property, status, and legal identity changed. During that period, Lucius continued performing his duties. At first, this felt absurd. Each morning he woke and completed assignments exactly as before, reviewed records, managed inventories, organized correspondence. Nothing had changed, yet everything had changed. The contradiction felt difficult to describe. Every familiar task now carried an expiration date. Soon he would no longer belong to the household. Soon his relationship with the world would fundamentally differ. The waiting proved surprisingly difficult. Hope had sustained him for years. Now anticipation replaced hope. Anticipation proved no easier to manage. Finally, the day arrived. The legal ceremony itself remained relatively modest. A magistrate confirmed the required procedures. Witnesses verified the instructions. Documents were completed. Names were recorded. Formal declarations were made. Then, after decades of slavery, Lucius ceased being property. The moment contained no dramatic music, no cheering crowds, no divine signs, just paperwork, words, signatures, formal recognition. Yet few moments in his life carried greater significance. He walked out of the building under the afternoon sun, paused, looked around. Rome appeared exactly as it had yesterday. The same streets, the same noise, the same crowds. Nothing visible had changed. Yet the city felt entirely different. For the first time since childhood, no owner waited for him. No master controlled his movements. No legal claim existed over his body. The sensation felt almost unreal. That evening, several members of the former household organized a small gathering. Not an official celebration, simply a quiet acknowledgement among people who respected him. Publius attended. Several administrators attended. Even a few freedmen associated with the household appeared. They shared food, Stories, memories, conversations stretched late into the night. More than once, someone asked the same question. What will you do now? Lucius laughed every time, because he genuinely did not know. For years, his life had followed established routines. Freedom removed the structure. It offered possibilities. Possibilities required choices. Choices required decisions. Decisions felt unfamiliar. The following weeks became an education in freedom. Simple tasks revealed unexpected complications. Where would he live? How would he earn money? Which opportunities deserved pursuit? Which risks deserved avoidance? Freedom provided rights. It did not provide instructions. Fortunately, Cassianus's will included additional assistance. Alongside manumission came a modest financial gift, not enough to create wealth, enough to begin, enough to prevent immediate hardship. The gesture reflected the senator's practical nature. Freedom without resources often produced new difficulties. Lucius appreciated the thoughtfulness. Several freedmen offered advice. Some suggested entering business. Others recommended administrative work. One encouraged him to purchase a small property. Another proposed partnership opportunities. The variety of opinions proved overwhelming. Eventually, Lucius accepted temporary employment, assisting with administrative matters connected to the Cassianus estates, not as a slave, as a paid worker. The distinction mattered enormously. The work itself remained familiar. The relationship did not. For the first time, he negotiated terms, discussed compensation, made decisions voluntarily. Every interaction reinforced his new status. Yet freedom also brought unexpected loneliness. This surprised him. He had imagined liberation, solving everything. Reality proved more complicated. For decades, the household had provided structure, community, predictability. Even limitations create familiarity. Once removed, empty spaces appeared. Some evenings felt strangely quiet. No shared quarters, no familiar routines, no group of servants discussing the day's events. Independence carried solitude. Nobody had warned him about that. One afternoon, several months after gaining freedom, Lucius visited a marketplace near an area he had known years earlier. The city continued changing. New buildings appeared. Old businesses vanished. Neighborhoods evolved. As he walked through the crowd, a familiar voice called his name. He stopped immediately, turned, stared. For several seconds, he could not believe what he saw. Then recognition arrived. Diodorus, older, slightly heavier, more gray in his hair, yet unmistakably Diodorus. The two men simply stared at one another, shock competing with disbelief. Then both began laughing. Genuine laughter, the sort that emerges only when reality becomes temporarily absurd. After years of silence, after years of separation, They had somehow crossed paths again. Rome, despite its size, occasionally produced impossible moments. They spent hours talking, hours sitting in a nearby tavern and attempting to compress years into conversation. Diodorus's story proved remarkable. His purchaser had eventually freed him as well. He now worked as a clerk for a merchant enterprise, not wealthy, not influential, but free. The coincidence seemed extraordinary. Two former slaves, separated by sale, reunited years later as free men. Life occasionally produced outcomes no storyteller would dare invent. As evening approached, their conversation turned reflective. Memories surfaced. Titus, Quintus Varro, the old household, the people who had vanished along the way. Some names remained vivid. Others had faded. Time continued its work. Eventually, Diodorus asked a question, a familiar question, the same question from years earlier. If freedom arrived tomorrow, what would you do first? Lucius smiled immediately. He remembered. Of course he remembered. Diodorus smiled as well. Then both men laughed, because neither had answered properly all those years ago. Neither had known, and now they finally possessed the answer. Not a dramatic answer, not an extraordinary answer. Simply life, ordinary life, choices, opportunities, mistakes, friendships, responsibilities, the simple privilege of directing one's own future. Yet even as Lucius embraced that future, he remained aware of a difficult truth. Millions of slaves throughout the empire would never experience what he had experienced. Millions would continue laboring in households, fields, mines, workshops, and docks. Some would die enslaved. Some would grow old enslaved. Some would never hear freedom discussed in relation to themselves. His story represented possibility, not typicality, and that reality never entirely left him, because freedom had transformed his life, but it had not transformed Rome. Part 9. Freedom changed many things. It did not change the empire. Every morning Rome still woke to the labor of countless slaves. Doors opened, markets filled, goods moved through ports, workshops produced tools, farms supplied grain, wealth accumulated. Beneath nearly every layer of society stood enslaved workers whose efforts made daily life possible. Lucius understood this more clearly than most, because he had spent decades among them, because he had once been one of them, and because freedom did not erase memory. During his first year as a freedman, he discovered something unexpected. People treated him differently, not dramatically, not universally, yet noticeably. Roman society paid close attention to status. Citizens occupied one category. Freedmen occupied another. Slaves occupied yet another. The distinctions mattered. A freedman remained legally free, but traces of former slavery lingered. Certain opportunities remained limited. Certain prejudices persisted. Some people viewed freedmen with respect. Others viewed them with suspicion. Many viewed them as useful. Lucius learned to navigate these realities carefully. Fortunately, his years of administrative experience provided valuable skills. Literacy remained uncommon compared to modern standards. Accurate record-keeping remained valuable. Reliable accountants remained useful. Work arrived steadily. Not glamorous work, not prestigious work, but honest work, the kind that paid expenses and built stability. Over time, he rented a modest residence, small, simple, entirely his own. The first night he slept there felt strangely emotional. The room contained little furniture. The walls appeared plain. The space lacked luxury. Yet nobody could sell him away from it. Nobody could order him elsewhere. Nobody owned the man sleeping beneath that roof. That knowledge alone transformed everything. Months became years. Life settled into routines. Business occupied most days. Friendships filled some evenings. The future gradually became something he planned rather than something he endured. For the first time since childhood, he began making decisions based upon preference rather than necessity. The experience remained almost unfamiliar. One spring afternoon, Diodorus arrived carrying exciting news. The merchant company employing him intended to expand operations. Additional administrators would be needed. Reliable administrators, experienced administrators. Lucius immediately understood the implication. Diodorus was offering an opportunity. The proposal required careful consideration, better income, greater responsibility, increased risk. Such decisions belonged to free men. Years earlier, someone else would have chosen for him. Now the choice rested entirely in his own hands. He accepted. The work proved demanding. Trade connected every corner of the empire. Contracts arrived from distant provinces. Shipments crossed seas. Goods moved along roads stretching thousands of miles. The scale fascinated him. Sometimes he found himself reviewing documents originating from regions near the lands where he had been born. Not the exact village, not close enough, yet enough to awaken old memories. Those memories never disappeared completely, even after decades, even after freedom. Childhood remained distant, yet strangely present, like a voice heard through fog. One evening, after reviewing records late into the night, Lucius realized something remarkable. He had lived in Rome longer than he had lived anywhere else. The city that once felt alien now contained most of his memories, most of his friendships, most of his life. The realization produced mixed emotions. Rome had taken everything from him. Rome had also become home. Contradictions rarely resolved neatly. Several years later, another significant event occurred. Publius gained freedom. The news reached Lucius through mutual acquaintances. He attended the small celebration, watching the younger man experience emotions similar to his own proved strangely moving. Excitement, relief, uncertainty, hope, the familiar combination, remained visible. During the gathering, Publius approached him. "You were right," Lucius smiled, "about what maybe shouldn't become your entire life." The younger man laughed softly. "I didn't understand then." Lucius nodded. Neither had he when Titus first offered similar advice. Some lessons required years. Looking around the gathering, Lucius noticed something interesting. Several former slaves stood together. Different backgrounds, different stories, yet shared experiences connected them. They understood one another in ways others often could not. The fear of sale, the uncertainty of ownership, the habit of measuring words carefully, the long adjustment to freedom. Such experiences left marks invisible to outsiders. Time continued its relentless march. Seasons changed. Emperors changed. Administrators changed. Businesses rose and fell. Lucius entered middle age, then moved beyond it. The transition happened gradually, almost unnoticed. One day, he simply realized younger workers viewed him as an older man. The realization felt impossible. Had so many years truly passed? Apparently they had. His hair began showing gray. His joints occasionally complained after long days. He found himself repeating stories, a sure sign of advancing age. Yet compared to many people, he considered himself fortunate. He possessed stability, friendships, meaningful work, most importantly, choice. Choice remained the greatest difference between freedom and slavery. Not comfort, not wealth, choice, the ability to direct one's own life, the ability to say yes, the ability to say no, the ability to decide. Many people took such things for granted. Lucius never did. One summer, decades after his arrival in Rome, he undertook a journey he had postponed for years, a journey northward, toward the frontier regions of his childhood, not because he expected answers, not because he expected reunions, simply because the question had remained unresolved for too long. Diodorus warned him gently, "You may find nothing." Lucius understood. He expected nothing, yet he went anyway. The journey lasted weeks. Roads carried him through towns and countryside, across landscapes, both familiar and unfamiliar. Time had altered everything. Villages disappeared. New settlements emerged. Boundaries shifted. Generations passed. Eventually, he reached the general region where his childhood village had once stood. Finding the exact location proved difficult. Memory and reality rarely align after decades. Yet, with local assistance and persistent effort, he located the remains of an abandoned settlement. Whether it truly represented his village remained uncertain. The years had erased certainty. A few foundations survived, fragments of structures, little else. Lucius stood quietly among the ruins. Wind moved through grass. Birds called in the distance. No dramatic revelations appeared. No lost relatives emerged. No miraculous discoveries occurred. Just silence. Yet the silence felt important, because the journey completed something. A circle left open for too long. The boy captured at 12 had spent decades wondering. The old man, standing among the ruins, finally understood. The past could be remembered. It could be honored, but it could not be reclaimed. Eventually, he returned to Rome, older, thoughtful, somehow lighter, and as the years continued passing, Lucius gradually began recognizing a truth that few young people appreciate. Freedom was not a single moment, not merely a legal ceremony, not merely a document. Freedom was something practiced every day, through choices, through responsibilities, through the quiet act of directing one's own life. A lesson he would continue learning during the final decades of his remarkable journey. Part 10. The journey north remained in Lucius's thoughts long after he returned to Rome. Not because he had discovered anything extraordinary. Quite the opposite. He had discovered very little. No surviving relatives. No hidden records. No miraculous reunion. Only the passage of time. Yet sometimes absence carried its own meaning. For decades, part of him had remained trapped in a question. What happened? Now he understood that some questions never received satisfying answers. Life continued anyway. Rome welcomed him back with its usual chaos. Street vendors shouted. Carts rattled across stone roads. Merchants negotiated. Children ran through crowded alleys. The city seemed unchanged. Yet Lucius felt different. The trip had forced him to accept something important. The boy who lost everything no longer defined him completely. That chapter would always remain part of his story, but it was no longer the entire story. He was now an aging freedman, a businessman, a friend, a mentor, a man with decades of experiences beyond his capture. The realization brought a sense of peace he had not expected. Years continued passing. His work gradually became less demanding, not because opportunities disappeared, because his priorities changed. When he was younger, every advancement felt important. Every contract mattered. Every success seemed significant. Age altered those perspectives. He still cared about his work. He simply cared about other things as well. Conversations, friendships, quiet evenings, simple pleasures, the sorts of things people often overlook while chasing larger ambitions. Diodorus remained a constant presence. The two men had become almost like brothers, not by blood, by survival. Their friendship stretched across decades of shared experiences. Few people understood their lives as completely as they understood each other's. One evening, They sat together, overlooking a busy section of the city. The sun slowly descended behind distant rooftops. The golden light reflected across marble buildings and tiled roofs. For a while, they simply watched. Eventually, Diodorus laughed. "Do you remember Quintus Varro?" Lucius smiled. "How could I forget? Back then, he seemed so important." The observation amused them both, because it was true. When they were young slaves, men like Quintus appeared enormous, powerful, unavoidable. Their decisions shaped entire lives. Yet now, looking back across the decades, the perspective felt different. Quintus had been important, but only temporarily. Like everyone else, time reduced even powerful figures to memories. Emperors died, senators died, generals died, merchants died. Everyone eventually joined history. The realization felt strangely comforting. Years later, another reality emerged. Diodorus began slowing down. At first, the changes seemed minor. A little more fatigue, a little less energy. Then came occasional illnesses, longer recoveries, the unmistakable signs of aging. Lucius recognized them because he experienced many of the same changes himself. Their conversations increasingly turned toward reflection. Past events, old friends, memories, the topics younger men often avoid. One autumn afternoon, Diodorus asked a question, not the familiar question about freedom, a different one. What do you think mattered most? Lucius considered it. The answer seemed difficult. A lifetime contained too many moments, too many experiences. Eventually, he responded. People. Diodorus nodded immediately, as though he had expected the answer. Not money, not status, not business. People, the friendships, the conversations, the relationships that survived despite everything. Looking back, those memories shone brightest. Years of labor blurred together. Years of records blurred together. People remained. The answer felt correct. The empire itself continued changing around them. New leaders rose. Political conflicts emerged. Economic conditions shifted. Rome remained powerful, yet subtle signs of strain appeared from time to time. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, just reminders that even great systems evolved. Lucius occasionally reflected upon this. When he was a child, Rome had seemed eternal. Now he understood that nothing truly was. Not villages, not households, not fortunes, not empires. Everything changed eventually. One winter morning, news arrived that struck him deeply. Publius had established a successful business of his own. The younger man, once an anxious slave asking questions about freedom, had become a respected professional. The information filled Lucius with pride, not because he deserved credit, because it demonstrated possibility. One generation helping the next, knowledge passing forward, advice surviving. In many ways, Titus's influence had traveled through Lucius into Publius, a chain stretching across decades, a small legacy. The thought pleased him as his hair turned increasingly gray. Lucius found himself becoming something unexpected, a storyteller. Younger workers frequently sought him out, not because of authority, because of experience. He had lived through extraordinary circumstances, seen different worlds, served different masters, experienced slavery and freedom. Many people found such stories fascinating. At first, he resisted. Then gradually, he accepted the role. The stories mattered, not because they centered on him, because they preserved memories of people who otherwise might disappear completely. Titus, Marcus, the kitchen boy who died young, the workers sold away, the countless ordinary individuals' history rarely recorded. Someone should remember them. Someone should speak their names. Otherwise, they vanished entirely. One spring, many years after gaining freedom, Lucius walked through a marketplace where slaves were still bought and sold. The sight remained familiar, painfully familiar. Young captives stood waiting. Potential buyers examined them. Prices were discussed. Transactions occurred. Nothing had changed. The scene looked almost identical to the market, where he himself had once stood as a frightened child. For several minutes, he simply watched. The emotions proved complicated. Sadness, anger, understanding, helplessness. The institution that shaped his life continued functioning. His personal freedom had not ended slavery. It had merely changed his relationship to it. That realization never became easier. Eventually, he left the market and continued walking. The city stretched around him, busy, loud, alive, exactly as Rome had always been. Yet something else occupied his thoughts, a realization he had gradually reached over many years. The most remarkable aspect of his life was not survival, not freedom, not success. The most remarkable aspect was adaptation. Human beings possessed an extraordinary ability to continue, to endure, to adjust, to rebuild. The 12-year-old captive could never have imagined the life that followed. The free man walking through Rome could barely remember being anyone else. Both versions remained real. Both belonged to the same person. As old age approached more visibly, Lucius increasingly understood that his own story was nearing its final chapters. Not immediately, but inevitably. And with that understanding came a new concern, not for himself, for memory, because memories vanished when people vanished. And there were still stories that deserved to be told, stories that would soon become his most important responsibility. Part 11. As the years continued their quiet march forward, Lucius became increasingly aware of something he had rarely considered when he was young. A person could disappear long before death. not physically. In memory, entire lives could fade away if nobody remained to remember them. The realization stayed with him after the visit to the slave market. For days afterward, he found himself thinking about faces from earlier decades, faces he had not considered in years. The elderly servant Marcus, the kitchen boy whose fever had ended his life before adulthood, the workshop laborers sold during Quintus Varro's financial troubles, the countless men and women whose names appeared briefly in his life before vanishing forever. Rome had consumed them all, just as it consumed millions of others. The empire excelled at recording taxes, property, military campaigns, political appointments, yet ordinary people often disappeared between the lines. Their labor built the empire. Their names rarely survived it. Lucius understood this because he had nearly become one of them. Had circumstances unfolded slightly differently, he might have died as an anonymous field worker, or a household servant, or a laborer in some distant province. Nothing guaranteed the life he eventually received. Luck played a larger role than many Romans cared to admit. One afternoon, while sorting old personal belongings, he discovered a worn wooden comb, the same comb he had carried from Quintus Varro's household decades earlier. The wood had darkened with age. Several teeth had broken. Most people would have discarded it years ago. Lucius sat quietly turning it in his hands. Such a small object, yet it contained entire chapters of memory. The crowded slave quarters, long workdays, conversations with Diodorus, the uncertain years before freedom. History often survived through ordinary things, not grand monuments, not triumphal arches, simple objects touched by ordinary people. The thought lingered. A few weeks later, Diodorus visited, carrying a bottle of wine. Not expensive wine, not rare wine, just something to share between old friends. The two men spent the evening talking, as they often did. The conversation wandered through familiar territory. Work, politics, changes within the city. Eventually, it settled upon the past. Again, age seemed to encourage such journeys. Diodorus laughed softly at one point. You realize we tell the same stories every year now. Lucius smiled. Only because you keep forgetting them. Diodorus pointed accusingly. There, that joke again. They both laughed, yet beneath the humor existed an uncomfortable truth. Memory changed. Details blurred. Timelines shifted. Names slipped away. The process happened slowly enough to seem invisible. Yet it never stopped. That night, after Diodorus departed, Lucius remained awake longer than usual, thinking, remembering, reflecting. For much of his life, survival had dominated his attention. Then freedom, then work. Now another concern emerged. Preservation, not of wealth, not of status, of stories. The following year, brought difficult news. Diodorus became seriously ill. The illness appeared during winter. At first, everyone expected recovery. Diodorus had survived countless hardships. Surely he would survive one more. Yet weeks passed without improvement. The familiar pattern felt alarmingly similar to illnesses Lucius had witnessed before. Doctors visited. Treatments were attempted. Friends offered support. Nothing seemed to help. Lucius spent as much time with him as possible. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply sat together. The years of friendship made conversation optional. One snowy evening, Diodorus appeared stronger than he had in weeks. For a brief moment, hope returned. The two men spoke for hours. About everything, about nothing, the way old friends often do. At one point, Diodorus smiled. "You know what I still find funny?" Lucius looked up. "What?" "That we never answered the question properly." Lucius immediately knew which question. The question from decades earlier. The question about freedom. Diodorus chuckled. "We spent years imagining freedom as some grand destination." He paused, catching his breath. Turns out it was mostly ordinary life. Lucius nodded. Yes, and that was enough. The statement hung quietly between them. Simple, honest, true. A few days later, Diodorus died. The loss struck harder than Lucius expected. Perhaps because some part of him believed the friendship would continue indefinitely. After all they had survived, after all the years, surely there would be more conversations, more evenings, more stories. Instead, there was silence. The funeral remained modest. Friends gathered, colleagues gathered, former associates gathered. People shared memories, stories, laughter, tears, all the familiar rituals humans perform when trying to make sense of absence. Afterward, Lucius walked home alone through the streets of Rome. The city remained unchanged. Vendors still sold goods. Crowds still filled intersections. Life continued. It always continued. Yet something felt missing. Not because Diodorus had been unique to the world, because he had been unique to Lucius. No one else could replace shared history. No one else remembered exactly the same things. Entire portions of the past suddenly felt quieter. For many months afterward, Lucius found himself instinctively thinking of things he wanted to tell Diodorus. A joke, a piece of news, a memory. Then reality returned. The habit slowly faded. The absence remained. By now, Lucius had become an old man, truly old. The transition happened so gradually that he barely noticed. Then one day, he realized younger workers treated him with the same respect he once reserved for Marcus and Titus. The realization felt strange. He now belonged to the generation of elders, the generation carrying memories others lacked. Increasingly, people sought his advice, not because he possessed extraordinary wisdom, because he possessed perspective. He had witnessed change, seen fortunes rise and fall, experienced slavery and freedom, endured grief and joy. Such experiences accumulated value over time. One young clerk asked him a question during a business meeting. What was Rome like when you first arrived? Lucius almost laughed. The question sounded simple, yet answering it proved difficult. Which Rome? The terrifying Rome, seen through the eyes of a frightened child. The exhausting Rome of slavery. The hopeful Rome of freedom. The familiar Rome of old age. The city remained the same. The observer changed. Eventually, he answered as best he could. But afterward, the question continued occupying his thoughts. Memory did not merely preserve the past. It reshaped it. The years softened certain wounds, sharpened certain moments, enlarged some details, reduced others. Human memory resembled a storyteller more than a record keeper. As another winter approached, Lucius began spending less time working, not because he needed to, because he wanted to. Financially, he remained comfortable, not wealthy, comfortable enough. The pursuit of more wealth no longer interested him. Time interested him. Time had become precious, more precious than money, more precious than status, more precious than nearly anything. And as he spent quiet evenings reflecting upon the long road from captivity to freedom, he found himself asking a final question. Not what happened, not what might happen, but what remained after everything, after all the losses, after all the changes. What truly remained? The answer would come slowly, through memory, through friendship, through the simple fact that a life, however ordinary, still mattered. Part 12. The answer did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually, like dawn appearing over distant hills. Slow, quiet, easy to miss if one was not paying attention. For much of his life, Lucius had measured time through survival. One difficult season followed another. One responsibility followed another. One challenge followed another. There was always something demanding attention, something requiring effort, something requiring endurance. Old age changed that. For the first time in decades, long stretches of quiet entered his life. Quiet encouraged reflection. Reflection encouraged understanding. And understanding often arrived unexpectedly. The winter after Diodorus's death felt particularly long, not because the weather proved unusually harsh, because loneliness altered perception. Certain days seemed larger than they actually were. Certain evenings seemed quieter than they actually were. Grief possessed a strange ability to reshape ordinary experiences. Lucius knew this. He had witnessed grief many times before, yet knowledge rarely eliminated pain. He spent much of that winter walking through Rome, not for business, not for necessity, simply to observe. The city had become a companion of sorts, a familiar presence stretching across nearly his entire life. Every neighborhood contained memories. Every street carried echoes of different decades. Some locations had changed completely. Others appeared almost untouched. One morning, he found himself standing near the workshop district where Quintus Varro's business had once operated. The buildings remained. The people did not. Different owners, different workers, different lives. Nothing lasts forever. The realization no longer saddened him. It simply felt true. He stood there for several minutes, remembering, then continued walking. That became his habit, visiting places connected to different chapters of life. The marketplace, where he first encountered Diodorus. The district, where he rented his first home as a freedman. The roads leading toward Cassianus's former residence. Each location contained memories layered upon memories. A lifetime spread across a city. During one such walk, he encountered something unexpected. Publius, though no longer young, the realization surprised him. In Lucius's mind, Publius remained the eager clerk asking questions about freedom. Reality disagreed. Publius now possessed gray hair of his own, lines around his eyes, the unmistakable appearance of middle age. Time had touched everyone. The two men spent the afternoon together, talking, remembering, reflecting. At one point, Publius mentioned his children, then his grandchildren. Grandchildren. The word caught Lucius's attention, not because grandchildren were unusual, because they represented continuity, a future extending beyond a single life. Publius noticed the reaction. "You never married, did you?" Lucius shook his head. "No." The answer carried no bitterness, simply fact. Slavery complicated such possibilities. Then freedom arrived late. Life followed different paths. Publius nodded thoughtfully. Neither man felt the need to elaborate. Some roads simply unfolded differently. That evening, after returning home, Lucius found himself thinking about legacy, not in the way wealthy senators thought about legacy. Not estates, not monuments, not political influence. Something simpler. What remains after a person is gone? The question seemed increasingly important because his own life was entering its final stage. He felt it, not dramatically, not fearfully, simply honestly. The body provided reminders. Long walks required more effort. Cold weather lingered in aching joints. Fatigue arrived more easily than before. The years had accumulated. No amount of wisdom changed that. Spring returned, then summer, then autumn. Seasons continued their endless cycle. One day blended into another, yet each carried small moments of meaning. Conversations, friendships, memories, ordinary experiences, the very things younger people often overlook. Lucius gradually realized that most of life consisted of ordinary experiences. History books focused on dramatic events, wars, emperors, revolutions, disasters, yet ordinary days occupied the vast majority of human existence. Most people never commanded armies. Most people never governed provinces. Most people simply lived, worked, loved, suffered, endured, and somehow that seemed important because people like Marcus mattered. People like Titus mattered. People like Diodorus mattered, even if historians never recorded their names. One afternoon, while sorting personal belongings, Lucius discovered an old wax tablet. The writing had mostly faded. Time had damaged much of it, yet portions remained visible. A list of household supplies. Nothing remarkable, nothing historically significant. Yet he smiled, because he recognized the handwriting. Titus, the old administrator, had written those figures decades earlier. A tiny fragment of a life, preserved accidentally. Lucius sat quietly holding the tablet, thinking about all the people whose traces vanished completely. How many stories disappeared? How many memories faded? How many ordinary lives passed unnoticed? Millions. The number felt impossible to comprehend. And yet, every one of those lives had felt important to the person living it. That thought stayed with him. Weeks later, while speaking with a young merchant, Lucius heard a familiar complaint. The merchant worried constantly about money, about advancement, about success. The concerns sounded familiar. Many people carried them. After listening patiently, Lucius offered a simple observation. You would be surprised how little of that matters when you're old. The merchant laughed, assuming it was a joke. Lucius smiled, but he wasn't joking. Perspective changed with age. Things once considered urgent became less important. Things once overlooked became precious. Time, friendship, choice, those remained valuable. Years continued passing. Lucius became increasingly respected within his community, not because of wealth, not because of status, because he had lived. People sensed it. Experience carries a certain weight, a certain authority. One does not need titles to possess it. Occasionally, younger men sought him out, specifically for advice. The situation amused him. He never considered himself particularly wise. Most of his knowledge came from mistakes, from hardship, from surviving circumstances he never would have chosen. Yet perhaps that was wisdom, or at least part of it. One evening, near sunset, he sat outside his home watching people pass. Children chased one another through the street. Merchants packed away goods. Neighbors exchanged greetings. The scene appeared entirely ordinary. Yet Lucius found it beautiful, not because it was extraordinary, because it wasn't. Ordinary life, the very thing he and Diodorus had once struggled to imagine, the very thing slavery had denied them for so long, the very thing freedom eventually provided. As darkness settled across the city, another realization emerged. The answer to the question that had occupied him since Diodorus's death. What remains? Not wealth, not power, not fame. What remains are the lives touched along the way, the people remembered, the kindness shown, the lessons shared, the friendships built. Those things outlast everything else. And with that understanding, Lucius entered the final chapter of his long journey, a chapter quieter than the others, yet perhaps the most meaningful of all. Part 13. Old age does not arrive like a sudden event in Rome. It creeps in quietly, disguised as ordinary days. One morning, a man walks a little slower. Another morning, he pauses before climbing stairs. Then one day, he realizes the city no longer feels designed for his pace. Lucius noticed these changes without needing anyone to point them out. They simply became part of life. Work had already faded into the background of his existence, not completely gone, but reduced. Occasional consultations, advice offered to younger administrators, small involvement in accounts that no longer required full responsibility. The empire still demanded work from everyone, but it no longer demanded everything from him. That space gave room for reflection, and reflection, over time, reshaped how he understood his life. He often thought about the boy he once was, 12 years old, running through forests near the Danube, not yet aware that the world contained markets for human beings, not yet aware that life could be broken into ownership. That boy felt distant now, not erased, but separated by layers of experience too thick to fully cross. Sometimes Lucius would sit quietly and try to remember his mother's voice. He could still hear fragments, not complete sentences, not full conversations, just tones, moments, the feeling of being called home for food, the sound of wind through wooden walls. Memory had become like an old painting, faded, but still recognizable if one looked carefully enough. One afternoon, a messenger arrived carrying news from a former acquaintance in Cassianus's extended network. It was not unusual for such messages to arrive even years later. Connections formed during service often lingered into freedom. The letter mentioned Publius. He had grown ill, not immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to slow his work. Lucius felt a familiar heaviness, not shock, not panic, something softer, the awareness that time eventually reaches everyone, even those who once seemed young. He visited Publius a few days later. The younger man, no longer truly young, looked tired, but still aware. They spoke for a long time, about work, about family, about the passing of years. At one point, Publius laughed quietly. I used to think freedom meant everything becoming easier. Lucius nodded slowly. And now, Publius exhaled. Now I think it just means you carry your own burdens. Lucius accepted that, without argument. It felt accurate. Freedom had never removed difficulty. It had only changed its shape. After leaving Publius's home, Lucius walked through familiar streets for a long time. The sun was low. Shadows stretched across stone roads. He passed places that once meant everything to him. The administrative offices where he first rose in Cassianus's household. The market where he once stood as an uncertain freedman. The tavern where he reunited with Diodorus after years of separation. Each location carried emotional weight, yet none of them held the past exactly as he remembered it. Memory and reality never aligned perfectly. They overlapped. They disagreed. They softened each other. That evening, Lucius returned home and sat quietly for a long time. He had begun doing this more often, sitting, thinking, letting time pass without urgency. There was no longer a sense that everything needed to be achieved, no longer a sense of rushing towards something. That feeling had belonged to younger years. Now time felt more like something to observe than something to chase. Another season passed, then another. Rome continued its rhythm of life, unchanged in its essentials. Governors came and went. Trade expanded and contracted. New buildings rose. Old structures decayed. The empire, vast as it was, moved with a constant pulse that never fully stopped. Lucius sometimes thought about how strange it was that so many lives overlapped within this one system. Slaves still worked in households. Freedmen still negotiated contracts. Citizens still debated politics. Merchants still pursued profit. Everyone occupied the same world, yet experienced it differently. That realization no longer disturbed him. It simply felt like truth. One winter evening, Lucius felt unwell. Nothing dramatic, just fatigue, a heaviness that lingered longer than usual. He dismissed it at first. Age brought such days. But as days passed, the feeling remained. He reduced his walking, rested more frequently, accepted that his body required attention in ways it once did not. Friends noticed. Visiting became more frequent. Concern appeared in conversations. He assured them he was fine, and for a time he was. Spring returned again. He stepped outside one morning and noticed something small. The air felt lighter. The city sounded louder. Life continued, as it always did, but something within him had shifted. Not fear, not urgency, a quiet awareness that he had entered a final stretch of time that could not be measured in decades anymore. He no longer thought in decades, only years, perhaps less, yet there was no regret. Regret belonged to earlier stages of life. He had already made peace with the path that brought him here, captured as a child, servant, slave, administrator, freedman, friend, witness, survivor. Each role had shaped him. Each stage had added something. Even suffering had not been meaningless in the way he once feared. It had carved understanding into him. One afternoon, Diodorus appeared again in his thoughts more vividly than usual, not as a distant memory, but as if he had just spoken. Lucius smiled slightly. "I think I finally understand what you meant," he whispered to no one. The room remained silent. Of course it did, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full of all the voices that had once lived there. Titus, Diodorus, Marcus, Publius, even Quintus Varro, in his own distant way. A lifetime of people, a lifetime of crossings. That evening, Lucius wrote something down. Not an official record, not a business note, just words, fragments of memory, names, moments, stories he did not want to lose. He did not know who would read it, or if anyone ever would, but that no longer mattered as much as it once might have. The act itself mattered, the preservation, the refusal to let certain lives disappear entirely. When he finished, he placed the tablet aside and looked out toward the city. Rome stretched endlessly beneath the evening sky, loud, alive, unbothered by individual lives, yet built entirely from them. And for the first time in many years, Lucius felt something close to complete understanding, not of the world, but of his place within it. Small, temporary, real, and enough. Part 14, final part. Night settled over Rome with its usual weight, swallowing streets, softening edges, turning marble and stone into quiet silhouettes. Lucius sat by the small opening of his home, watching the last traces of daylight disappear. His breathing had grown slower over the past months. Not painful, just measured, like everything else now. It seemed to follow its own quieter rhythm. The tablet he had written the previous evening still rested nearby. Names, fragments, memories carefully placed into words, as if language could hold back time for a little longer. He knew better, of course. Time never paused. It only moved forward. But writing had never been about stopping it, only preserving what could still be preserved. That night, sleep came lightly, not fully deep, more like drifting in and out of awareness. And in that drifting space, memories returned with unusual clarity, not confused or faded, but sharp, almost present. He saw the Danube forests again. He felt the cold air of the morning. He was taken. He heard the distant shouting, the chaos, the breaking of a life into something unrecognizable. Then Rome, always Rome, the markets, the crowds, the noise that never truly stopped. He saw Quintus Varro's household, the early mornings, the exhaustion, the silent lessons learned under pressure. He saw Diodorus laughing in the courtyard. He saw Titus correcting records by lamplight. He saw Marcus moving slowly through aging years of labor. Faces returned one by one, as if the past itself had gathered to stand quietly around him. There was no fear in these memories now, only recognition. At some point, he woke again. The night had deepened further. The city outside had grown quieter. Even Rome, for all its life, eventually softened into silence when enough hours passed. Lucius sat up slowly. His body felt heavier than usual. Not alarming, just present in a different way. He understood without needing explanation. Age had reached its final stage. There was no dramatic realization, no sudden moment of clarity, only acceptance, arriving the way most truths arrive at the end of life. Quietly, naturally, he stood slowly and walked a few steps inside. The room was simple. Nothing excessive remained in it. Only what was necessary. Only what had meaning. He looked once more at the tablet he had written, then placed his hand over it, not to protect it, just to acknowledge it. A life had happened. That was all. Outside, the first light of dawn began to form. Not bright yet, only a thin suggestion of it along the horizon. Rome would soon wake again, as it always did. But Lucius would not experience that waking in the same way. He sat once more, not lying down, not resisting, simply resting where he was. And as the light slowly grew, his thoughts did not scatter. They gathered, not into confusion, but into simplicity. The boy from the Danube, the slave of Rome, the administrator of records, the freedman who learned to choose. All of them existed together now, without conflict. Not separate lives, but one continuous path. A long arc of existence shaped by forces beyond control and moments of quiet decision. And in the end, what remained was not pain, not regret, not even longing. What remained was the strange, steady understanding that even a life lived under ownership, uncertainty, and loss could still hold meaning once it was fully seen. Footsteps passed outside. Distant voices began to return to the waking city. Somewhere, a vendor called out. Somewhere else, a cart rolled across stone. The world continued as it always had. Lucius allowed himself a faint breath that carried the weight of many years. Then slowly, the breath did not return in the same way again. There was no violence in it, no struggle, only completion. A life that had begun in chains and moved through freedom had reached its natural end. And Rome, vast and unchanging in its rhythm, did not stop for it. It never did. But somewhere within its endless noise, the memory of one life remained, carried forward by those who had known him, by those who had once shared bread, work, silence, and time, by those who would, for as long as memory allowed, continue telling small fragments of his story, because even in an empire that consumed millions of lives, some of them refused to vanish completely. And Lucius, once a nameless boy, once a slave, once a freedman, became exactly that, a story that endured, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was human. And in the long history of Rome, that alone was enough. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.